a time when we have turned Columbus Day on its head, or activists whose footsteps we follow have turned this day that celebrated colonization into a time that celebrates those who have been trampled. In the Bible, when Moses is meeting God in the cave, God instructs Moses to take off his shoes, for he walks on holy ground. Indeed, this ground is holy ground. I would do a land acknowledgement, but I have come to understand that these can be empty without proper action. We've heard it before, and many of you may know better than I, who first occupied this land, the Omaha, those who flow against the water. And indeed we do flow, don't we? We flow from conflict to conflict, heartbreak to heartbreak, and in between that we find some life, some little glimmer of joy, of hope that keeps us at love's table. And it may be hard, friends. I'll be sharing some words from our president, Reverend Sophia Betancourt, denominational president, on the Discord today about the conflict between Hamas and Israel. I believe she puts it far better than I ever could. Given our time, I'd like to jump right into this, because I have a lot to say, and I'm not really sure how I want to say it. It's tricky. I've been talking to Ursula Goodenough herself, the acclaimed microbiologist and author of Sacred Depths of Nature, a friend of mine and a confidant, as I try to work through these complex theologies of immanence and materialism. How can we do good myth-making, good religion, good theology, yes, not on high with transcendence and stuff outside of this world, but with the stuff of the world, of flowers, and moss, and stones, birds, fish, people. But first, I want to ask a question. What are you? You might have an intuitive idea about what that is. You might say, draw an imaginary line around your body. And everything in here is me, and everything outside of me is not me. And yet that seems somewhat challenged by things like glasses, or the fact that I don't know any of your birthdays. I have them on technology. My brain is, I'm not trying to be shady. Many of us rely upon technology to remember important dates, phone numbers, a brain outside of our brain. For those of us who might be mobility impaired, we might use a cane or a walker. This is no worse way of getting around, and yet these things become an extension of ourselves. Those of us with glasses, this technology that enables our sight, or I have contacts right now directly pressed against my eyeballs, and yet these are separate from me and yet enable my individuality, and so are they a part of me? There's almost a ship of Theseus problem. Sarah, can you spotlight the Ultracam for a second? Strange request. Just briefly. It is on, isn't it? Well, oh, there we are. Oh. Technology. What is spotlighting the Ultracam? There we go. Who is this? 'Tis I, allegedly. I have no memory of being covered in pasta sauce, but I am told, and by relationship to all the things in this holy book to me, this book of really old family photos of my mom and dad together, of my baptism. You can look at this if you want to later. It's quite the sight to see. But this little person is still me, and yet not. Much smaller. We lack the same memories. I have no memory of being covered in pasta sauce like this, and yet this photo is in this photo album that my mother gave me. Something has changed. I share the same DNA as this little critter, but not the same memories, not the same body, not the same height. Part of the same story and yet different. Plato and Heraclitus, old philosophers, proposed a ship of Theseus problem. Suppose there's a ship that over time, while on sea, the pieces are replaced one by one until one day the sailors recognize that, hey, this ship is made of new parts. Is it still the same ship, they might ask? Plato and Heraclitus go on further to say, what if somebody gathered up all those spare parts and built an exact replica of the original ship of Theseus? Which one is the original ship of Theseus? Which one is me, this person that exists back in time, this small child, or me? And I think intuitively we would say, we are who we are, right? Of course. I am me, this person was me, composes me in some way. It is kind of a mystery because our being is constantly changing. We are all in process, becoming something more, something new, something different. Process of life to death. The components of our bodies going back into the world to be remade into something new all over again. But what are we? Because our own bodies are not specifically individual per se. I have my hands, my heart, my mind, my self, but I also understand that there is a gut biome inside of me that is not human, that is more than human, but for whom my being, my metabolism, my homeostasis, even things like my mood and your mood are contingent upon these other life forms inhabiting our body. Sounds a little icky, but it's just true. And it's true for most forms of life. Swarming insects are another interesting example that can challenge our ideas about individuality and being. A beehive has parts, drones, worker bees, a queen. We can see these as discrete individuals. We can also understand that they are made of atoms. They also have their own gut microbiome. Are they individuals? But also the hive itself seems to function more like a whole individual. It can challenge our understanding of what it is to be an individual. Some kinds of slime molds, sort of keep on going with different kinds of critters. Some kinds of slime molds, well, if food is available, they'll be single-celled microbes. If food is scarce, they release a signal that causes them to aggregate together into a big slug that slithers around until it finds more food, then it spores. And out come all these other individual slime molds. Is the slug an individual? This is a bizarre reproductive system, but relatively common on our planet. There are so many more than human beings that challenge our understanding of what it is to be an individual, what it is to be a being at all. And if we follow this too far, we can find ourselves into some ontological muck, where are we just chemical processes and stochastic happenings, or are we what we feel like we are? Are we individuals? And some thinkers have proposed we set aside the idea of hard individuality in favor of individuality being on a spectrum. And I like this idea personally. It allows us to look at ourselves as being more than one and yet one at the same time. It allows us to look at the happenings of other kinds of life on this planet as to invite the challenge to our notions of individuality, but to help us to parse this line of who we are. And who we are is in process. Who we are is in flux and changing. This could be threatening. Our ideas, our body, our bones are new every 7 years, friends. Your bones are being used by your body to aid in blood circulation. I'm not an anatomy expert, so pardon me, but I do understand that our bones are new every 7 years. This hard part of who we are indeed in flux. This brings up this Buddhist idea of anatta, which is sometimes translated as non-self, sometimes incorrectly understood in the West as there being no self. This is a misunderstanding of Buddhism. To have the non-self idea is kind of like when they tell us ministers to be non-anxious. It does not mean that you won't be anxious, trust me. The anxiety is there. Is it on the surface? Is it reaching out randomly for people to take care of you? No. It's just hell. But it's understood to be part of the process of feelings we go through in the same way that our self is in process. Another Buddhist idea, Attika, is just this flow of self. David Hume took this a step further in developing his philosophy, where he thought that there were these 5 components of anatta: feelings, senses, mental activity, consciousness, and a 5th one I forget, but Hume asserted that these are all just, you could have an arbitrary number of perceptions, and at any given time, as these things shift in and out, that is who we are. We are necessarily in flux. It's kind of a strange and chaotic way to look at things. But nonetheless, I believe it underscores our capacity for radical and fundamental transformation. A transformation that we need, are we to navigate this life in its conflict, strife, and its heartbreak, to know that we can be the ones that we have been waiting for. But I also want to talk about animism, and I have very little time, so I'm going to crash through this as best I can. So we can understand ourselves as animals, correct? I believe that this is something that we can intuitively get our heads around. We are descended from primates. We ourselves are apes, make no mistake. We may, in our chairs, in our cars, in our societies, in our supposed self-importance, we are still fundamentally apes, primates. And if you go back far enough, we understand that our primate ancestors were also descended from other critters. Squirrels hiding beneath trees, beneath the foots of giant cold-blooded critters, dinosaurs. Further still, fish, proto-fish beneath the sea. Further still, single-celled organisms around hydrothermal vents. But where do these come from? Now, Ursula Goodenough and I were talking about this, the autocatalytic processes, essentially feedback loops and energy flows that can eventually become self-contained protocells, which we have no fossil evidence for because such things cannot survive the eons, but to which some people call an autogen. Made out of the hard stuff of matter, just spinning in the depths, waiting to make more of itself, but with no real desire or will or drive, no more than we would give a stone or a drop of water or a river or a mountain itself. And yet, here we are, perhaps descended from such a process emergent from the planetary matrix itself, by which I mean the energy flows from the sun and from the earth, from the deep, deep waters and the climate, the geophysical processes of tectonic shifts, and the life of other creatures. Creatures that learn to eat the sun and the air and make life out of light, and in doing so making oxygen and wiping out most all life. First great mass extinction brought about by the ancestors of our plant friends. And yet our entire existence is contingent upon them. We are indeed interwoven and belonging to a family of not just animals, and not just a family including plants, but perhaps, all things, skies, stones, waters, stars. Now, the universe may or may not just be here for us. I kind of doubt that. It's very, very big and very, very old. We are lucky to be here. It's a happenstance, perhaps, a miracle, one might say. But beautiful nonetheless, no matter how we characterize it. And in her book, Sacred Depths of Nature, Ursula Goodenough comes up to the idea of animism as a possible response to the more than human world. And in her book, she moves back from that a second and says, well, I don't personally experience the river as having agency or the mountain as having agency or a self. And yet many cultures do in some ways. That word animism, by the way, is invented by Western anthropologists as they went to study indigenous cultures to try to figure out how they could parse what they're doing and bringing their own perspectives forward. And so with our cultures, colonizers' understandings of spirits and ghosts, disembodied things, well, it might be that these people are talking to plants and rocks as though they're alive, but that is maybe a misconception. Perhaps it's an experience of personage and deep relationship to land. Suppose you lived on a river for all of your life, and the food and the fish and the water from that river nurtured you and sustained you. When the river flooded, it challenged you and your ancestors, and on and on and on and on and on. This river became as much a part of you as it is just a river in itself. You become a part of that river in the same way that I putting my contacts in my eyes, they become a part of me, or how I store your birthdays in my tablet. It becomes an extension of my brain. But I'd like to encourage friends in my brief time here is a deeper appreciation, a deeper relationship, I should say, to land. Now, we may not be living on waters, fishing for a living, farming for a living. Many of our ancestors farmed for a living, I know this, mine too, and had a particular relationship to land which we may lack in our modern context, denatured. Whether that word animism rings and sings to you or not, I encourage you to pay attention, to notice the other world that is right beneath your nose. In his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, David Abrams, who himself is an anthropologist, was in Bali studying folk magic. It's interesting. Sounds like a really cool thing to do, but he was talking to his host family as they were walking outside to lay ofrendas down. And he asked, what are you doing? And she said, I'm leaving an offering for the spirits. We said, okay, and curious, he went and checked the ofrendas, and they were being eaten by ants. Now, somebody haughty in their ivory tower might say, oh, these people. But David took it a step further and tried to be present with it and noticed that the spirits may well be the ants. Who are we to say that they are not? These beings that we share the world with, that we may form a relationship with. Here is food to not come into my house and eat more food. Having a relationship with the world in a deeply intimate way. It's not a thing that we will gain overnight. It's not a thing that will happen all at once. But such a perspective and such a term as animism, this perspective on the world as being a living thing, living things, a family, and us being a direct part of that family, not necessarily possessed with ghosts, but a truly immanent, realized and materialist view of the world, that we are indeed an expression of the earth, the whole planetary matrix coming to know itself. As Carl Sagan said, we are a way for this cosmos to know itself. With all the war and all the strife and all the pain, friends, we might ask if it's worth it. And I believe it still is. And I hope you can believe that with me. This world will break your heart. It will break it into pieces. But we have one another and many friends beyond these doors, and many friends in the trees and in the waters who call on us to be better stewards of the land, who call on our relationship, perhaps say hello to the next bird you see how it feels. Will they care? I don't know. But will it touch your heart? Maybe. It doesn't always matter what is capital T true, because we don't actually know what is true much of the time. We don't have a solid understanding of what life actually is. We don't know where consciousness emerges from. We have guesses. But if it's possible that life is an emergent property straight out of the planetary matrix of hard matter and chemical processes, if we are not to just be stochastic chemistry ourselves, if we are to retain our ontological self, then I imagine that we might practice the exercise of extending that agency and that care down the chain of being, and trust that it's not a hierarchy, it's a web of life. Respect for the interdependent web of life to which we are all connected, not a tiering, not a tree, but a rhizome that goes out into the world and connects each to all. As Mark Morrison Reed noted, the central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. Perhaps this is a lens that may help us do that, both to ourselves, obviously, to other animals that move around and skitter on this planet, obviously, perhaps even and hopefully to other plants and fungi, perhaps even to archaea and small life that we can't see, perhaps even to stones and rivers and skies and mountains and plains and grasses, and all that makes our life possible. All that makes life possible in the first place, in its own flux and in its own flow, changing like we change. One day, the mountains near my home in Appalachia will be ground into dust. One day, the Rockies will be ground into dust. Who knows how this world will change? But it is changing, and we along with it. So maybe lean into our mission here at Second Unitarian to be authentic, compassionate, and transformative stewards of this faith and this earth, and consider new ways of knowing this world. Scientifically, yes, intuitively also, and develop from those lenses and others we have yet to realize new ways of being and becoming on this earth, recognizing and honoring the real oneness of everything.